The vine twitched once, and a German sniper died. No one on the beachhead saw it happen, just the echo of a rifle cracking through the fog and a shape tumbling lifeless from a bell tower half a mile inland. To most, it was luck. To Corporal Benjamin Lakewood, it was geometry, instinct, and a handful of vines he wasn't supposed to touch. Anzio, Italy, February 1, 1944. The Allied line was choking on its own stillness. For 3 days, no man dared to lift his head above the rubble. The moment someone did, a sharp crack would split the air and another helmet would roll into the mud. German snipers ruled the beachhead like ghosts in the hills. They fired, vanished, and fired again. No pattern, no flash, just death. Before we continue, if you're interested in the untold practical stories of World War II that nobody teaches, hit subscribe. These stories changed warfare but never made it into official histories. Corporal Lakewood, a Mississippi-born farm boy turned Marine sniper, had watched his friends die one by one from shots no one could trace. Every manual told him to stay low, hold fire, and wait for a mistake. But the Germans weren't making mistakes. They were writing the rules, and he was done following them. Before dawn, Lakewood crawled through the muck with a bundle of vines wrapped around his arm, thick, green, elastic cords cut from the nearby olive groves. He tied one end around a loose branch 20 yards away, the other to a loop beside his rifle. "Sir'll skin you alive for this," whispered his spotter, Private Miller, eyes darting toward the command post. Lakewood didn't look up. "Sir's not the one getting picked off every hour." He yanked once, testing tension. The vine's quivered branches rustled just enough to catch the eye of any sniper watching from the hills. Then he waited. Seconds bled into minutes. The fog thinned, and then a glint, barely visible through the scope. A reflection small, circular, the telltale wink of a sniper's glass. Lakewood whispered, "There you are." He tugged the vine. The brush moved. The German took the bait. A shot cracked. Dirt sprayed a few feet from Miller's face. Lakewood didn't flinch. His crosshairs were already set. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger. His Springfield M1903A4 answered with one dull thump. A speck of movement vanished from the tree line, replaced by silence. "That's impossible," Miller muttered. Lakewood simply said, "One down." He began coiling another length of vine. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but focus. The plan had worked. The decoy had fooled a sniper trained on the Russian front, a killer with 100 confirmed kills. But Lakewood's innovation had a cost. He'd broken command protocol again. Snipers were forbidden from drawing attention, from creating false movement. The manuals called it reckless. But rules, he thought, didn't mean much when the enemy wrote new ones every morning. "Ben," Miller whispered, "Captain Richards catches you doing that again, you'll lose your stripes." Lakewood stared across the valley, where the last shelling smoke still curled upward. "If I follow every order," he said, "I'll lose more than stripes." He tied another vine. By the end of that morning, 3 more German snipers were dead. Every one of them had fallen for the same illusion, a trembling branch, a flicker of movement, a distraction that wasn't supposed to exist. Somewhere in the chain of command, someone would call it illegal. But down here, in the blood and fog of Anzio, it had another name: survival. When the Allies landed on January 22nd, 1944, it was meant to be a bold end-run bypass, the Gustav Line, strike toward Rome and break the Italian campaign wide open. General Lucas had called it a classic flanking maneuver. Eisenhower said it would be over in a week. But 2 weeks in, the beachhead had become a graveyard with no markers. The Germans reacted faster than anyone expected. Within days, Kesselring poured in reserves, tanks, artillery, elite paratroopers, and worst of all, snipers. They weren't just scattered riflemen. These were Wehrmacht ghost killers, survivors of Stalingrad, veterans of Finland, hunters trained to disappear after every shot, and they were good. They set up in bell towers, wine cellars, and buried bunkers. They picked off medics, spotters, lieutenants, even runners carrying coffee. No one was safe. Entire platoons crawled instead of walked. Movement was death. And morale? It didn't exist anymore. By February 2nd, the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, including Lakewood's company, had lost 39 men to confirmed sniper fire in just 48 hours. The rest were too afraid to move. Captain Richards tried rotating positions every 6 hours. He handed out extra scopes, gave pep talks, even ordered blind suppressive fire into the hills. None of it worked. The Germans simply vanished. Then rumors started to spread about one corporal using vines to bait the bastards. A man who dropped 4 snipers in a single morning without revealing his position once. Soldiers began calling it ghost fishing, and in war, rumors travel faster than bullets. Lakewood didn't care about the whispers. He worked alone, crawling silently at night to reset his lures. No 2 decoys were the same. One was a rusted helmet filled with stones. Another was a mannequin head carved from an ammo box, draped in mud-streaked burlap. Every target twitched when he pulled the vine just enough to provoke greed in the enemy scope. He was inventing deception with rope and instinct. By dawn, another sniper was down. The bell tower exploded a moment later. One of the Sherman tanks had been waiting. Coordinates passed quietly from Lakewood's spotter. No medals, no paperwork, just silence and fewer ghosts. But command wasn't amused. At HQ, Captain Richards slammed his hand on the desk. "This is unauthorized battlefield modification," he barked. "You start letting every corporal rig trees and waggle helmets, we lose control of the front." Lieutenant Maynard, who'd witnessed one of Lakewood's kills firsthand, stayed calm. "Sir, with respect, if we don't start letting our boys bend the rules, we'll be stacking them in rows by Friday." Silence. Then, "You didn't see this. Understood?" By the end of the second week, Lakewood had 11 confirmed kills, all snipers, all lured by string. They stopped laughing, and others started copying him. Across the 3rd Infantry, vines disappeared from olive trees. Fishing wire was requisitioned by radio operators for antenna repair. Helmets began appearing on bayonets, wobbling ever so slightly, a deadly invitation. It was an underground tactic, passed in whispers, perfected in blood, and it was working. Lakewood remained silent through it all. He didn't claim credit, didn't name his method. In his mind, it wasn't invention, it was necessity. His unit had no air support, no drone feed, no thermal scopes. All they had were guts, rifles, and whatever nature gave them. So when nature gave vines, he listened. Miller, his spotter, began keeping count. 12, maybe 13, he muttered, watching another body fall from a rooftop. Lakewood never looked up. 18. That's the number they sent. How do you know? Because they never send 20. But the enemy was watching too. And they were adapting. Soon, it wouldn't just be Allied snipers pulling strings. Soon, the Germans would set their own traps. And Lakewood's war would get personal. February 10th, 1944 dawn broke over Anzio like a blade of ice. A mist clung to the shattered vineyards beyond the railroad tracks, thick enough to blur the boundary between life and death. The olive grove stood motionless, still haunted by yesterday's gunfire. Somewhere out there, hidden among the ruins of an abandoned villa, Benjamin Lakewood stared through his scope. His breath was shallow, his trigger hand still, his mind coiled like wire, because something was wrong. The decoy helmet, his new one, hadn't drawn a shot. Not in 4 hours, not even a twitch from the hills. And that meant one thing. The game had changed. It started the day before. Corporal Lakewood and Private Miller had set up just west of the brick ruins known as Sector 14, a collapsed villa with shell-pocked walls and scorched rafters, perfect cover for any sniper. Lakewood placed one of his finest dummies, a shredded uniform filled with soil, leaning against a broken window, its helmet tilted slightly as if peering down the road. He tied the vine taut, wove it into nearby scrub. Then he waited. 10 minutes later, a shot cracked clean and sharp. It hit the edge of the helmet, just off center. A classic sniper's instinct, aim between the eyes. Miller grinned, but Lakewood didn't fire. He hadn't seen the muzzle flash. That night, back at the shell crater they called home, Lakewood ran over the angles again. "It wasn't real," he muttered. The sniper didn't try to kill. He tried to bait me. Miller froze. You're saying it was a decoy? Lakewood nodded. A string pull, just like mine. We're not the only ones adapting. The Germans had copied his trick. And now, the hunter was being hunted by someone who'd watched carefully, learned fast, and was setting the trap in reverse. The next morning, Lakewood didn't lay a dummy. He laid a trap. He dragged the body of a dead German soldier lifeless, since the mortar barrage 2 nights earlier, up to the edge of a stone wall. He rigged the corpse's arm to twitch, using a taut vine attached to his boot. The head slumped unnaturally, eyes wide open. It wasn't a pretty trick, but neither was war. He knew the enemy would be watching, waiting for him to appear again. So instead of using a decoy that looked like them, he used a corpse that was one of them. That was the bait. And for 2 hours silence. Then a flicker. Just beyond the second-floor window of the villa, behind blackened shutters, a shadow shifted. Lakewood didn't blink. His eyes were locked on that sliver of movement. The sun crept higher. Miller whispered, "You sure?" Lakewood nodded. He pulled the vine. The corpse's arm jerked. 2 shots cracked in perfect rhythm, one from the villa and one from Lakewood Springfield. Smoke drifted upward from the shattered window. The German had fired on his own fallen man. Lakewood had already shifted position. He didn't wait to confirm the kill. He knew. You don't miss at 300 yards. Not when you've been waiting 3 hours for a heartbeat. That night, Lakewood wrote nothing in his field journal. There was no room for glory in this kind of war. He simply carved a notch into the rifle stock, one more than yesterday. No name, no rank, just a count. But what disturbed him more was the method. His method. It wasn't just vines anymore. It was bodies. It was baiting men with their own dead. And the Germans had escalated it first. Now the Americans were talking. Other units began experimenting. A pair of engineers in the 7th Regiment tied wine bottles to fallen helmets. A Texan infantryman used a German tunic soaked in blood to bait a machine gunner. The deception was evolving, spreading like an infection. Lakewood sat alone, watching the moon rise behind a burned farmhouse. He lit a cigarette, hands still caked in mud and cordite. Miller leaned over. "What's the plan tomorrow?" Lakewood exhaled slowly. "I think tomorrow we change the game again." Because sniping at Anzio was no longer about patience. It was about imagination. And the next duel wouldn't be fought with bullets. It would be fought with fear. February 11th, 1944, the rain returned to Anzio. Not a downpour. Not the furious cannonade thunder that turned foxholes into swamps. This was the quiet kind, a steady hiss, like a whisper on canvas, slipping through broken windows and down the fractured walls of farmhouses long abandoned. Benjamin Lakewood crouched beneath a collapsed barn's beam, wrapped in oilskin and silence. His rifle lay across his knees. His fingers worked on something else. Wire, glass. A battery stripped from a busted German field radio. He wasn't building a trap. He was building doubt. After the duel in the villa, word had spread. Not officially, no brass wanted to admit a corporal was winning a sniper's war through tricks and psychology. But among the grunts and sharpshooters, Lakewood had become a myth. The vine ghost, the string puller, the man whose dummy helmets could summon German gunfire like some battlefield voodoo. But that was the problem. The Germans weren't falling for the same tricks anymore. 2 dummies had been left untouched in the past 48 hours. Even Miller's idea of a moving helmet on a stick had failed. The enemy wasn't stupid. They were watching, waiting, listening. That gave Lakewood an idea. The whisper device was crude. He took a German gas mask filter, drilled out the interior, and ran wire through it. At the tip, he placed a small metal blade not sharp enough to cut, but thin enough to vibrate. At the base, a broken phonograph diaphragm from a ruined house. The whole thing was mounted inside a hollowed-out ammo crate perched in the attic of a destroyed farmhouse near the front. With a little wind, it would hum. Not loud, just enough to be heard through scope glass, just enough to unsettle the mind. That night, the wind cooperated. A soft current swept in from the Tyrrhenian Sea. brushing over the broken rooftops and shattered wheat fields like fingers across a piano. The attic began to hum. A German sniper, later found with a snapped neck and bullet through the temple, had been spotted shifting his position 3 times in 20 minutes. Every time the wind picked up, he moved again. By dawn, his nerves were gone, his position exposed. Lakewood didn't even need the vine. He let the wind do the work. The Americans began whispering too. They told stories in mess tents and dugouts, of ghost helmets, of phantom shots, of the whisper box that could lure out Nazi marksmen like a siren song. Some said Lakewood had wired corpses with tape recorders. Others claimed he could imitate German voices through the trees. One man swore he saw a dummy crawl forward on its own. Lakewood never corrected them. Let fear do the heavy lifting. Let imagination spread faster than bullets. But the war had its way of reminding men that ghosts don't stop mortars. On February 13th, an 88mm shell landed on the eastern edge of the sector near the whisper box. The farmhouse was blown in half. Smoke and plaster rained down. The humming stopped. Lakewood arrived within the hour, boots crunching over scorched timber. He stepped over a charred beam. There, amidst the debris, lay the melted remains of the box. The Germans had found it, or feared it enough to destroy it. Miller approached, coughing through the dust. "They killed your ghost," he said. Lakewood shook his head. "No," he said. "They just gave him a martyr's grave." That night, the wind came again, but no whisper followed. Instead, Lakewood strung up a new dummy in a fresh position. A helmet, this time deliberately too high, visible from 3 angles. An obvious fake. But something odd happened. No one shot it. Not a sound. The Germans didn't fire not because they weren't there, but because they no longer trusted what they were seeing. It had worked. The string pull had become a strategy. The whisper box a legend. The battlefield itself had turned paranoid. Even Lakewood could feel it now, the weight of watching eyes, the question behind every shadow. Is that a man or a trick? 3 weeks later, a captured German sniper was interrogated by the 3rd Division's intel team. When asked why his unit had withdrawn from a fortified ridgeline without engaging, the sniper simply muttered, "The Americans, they're not fighting fair. They use the wind." Lakewood read the report over cold rations, then tucked it away. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just cleaned his rifle, because somewhere in the ruins, another whisper was coming. And next time, it might be real. February 17th, 1944 dusk fell like a slow curtain over Anzio. The sky bled orange behind the ruined villas, and the fields between the lines shimmered with smoke from smoldering trucks. For days, no sniper fire had come from the German side. Too quiet, too clean. Corporal Benjamin Lakewood lay belly down in the mud, his cheek pressed to the cold steel of his Springfield M1903A4. Miller crouched behind him, scanning the horizon through his spotting scope. "Nothing," Miller whispered. "Not a damn thing in 2 hours." Lakewood said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on a single shape, the faint silhouette of a German body sprawled on the slope near the olive grove. It hadn't moved since dawn, but something about it was wrong. The angle of the arm, the way the wind rippled the tunic, the glint of metal at the collar. Every instinct screamed that it was bait. He'd used bodies as bait himself. Now he was staring at one that had been placed for him. "Don't," Miller whispered. "It's a setup." Lakewood's voice was barely audible. "They're learning." The body's position was perfect downhill from the tree line, 300 yards out, backlit by the dying Sunday. Any sniper who tried to take the shot would have to rise just high enough to expose a glint, just high enough for a countershot. The Germans had built a mirror of his own method. He adjusted his focus slightly and caught it the faintest shimmer above a broken stone wall, 50 yards behind the corpse. A reflection off glass. Scope glass. Lakewood froze. He didn't move, didn't blink. The Germans were waiting for impatience for an American hand to tremble, for curiosity to win. He waited 5 minutes. Then 10. The corpse didn't move. Neither did the shimmer. Finally, Lakewood whispered, "We pull back." Miller frowned. "You're not taking the shot?" "No," Lakewood said. We let them think they fooled us. He withdrew slowly, dragging his rifle by the sling, crawling backward through the mud until they reached the burnt shell of a farmhouse. But inside, Lakewood didn't rest. He began sketching. Angles, distances, shadow fall. He was mapping their mirror trap. "We're going to break it," he muttered. "How?" Miller asked. Lakewood pointed at the map. "They think we only shoot what moves. So tomorrow, we'll make something move that shouldn't." By dawn, his plan was set. He waited until fog blanketed the olive grove again, thick enough to blur shapes into ghosts. He and Miller rigged a German corpse, the same one from the slope, with a single vine line. They dragged it 5 feet, then another, leaving faint drag marks in the mud, as if the dead man had come back to life and crawled. Then they pulled back to their new hide on higher ground. It was madness, but so was Anzio. At 0930, as the fog thinned, Lakewood gave a slow tug. The body shifted. A flash. A shot cracked from the stone wall where he'd seen the glint yesterday. Then Lakewood fired just once. The German's muzzle flash betrayed him. The bullet struck half a heartbeat later. A cry. Silence. When the smoke cleared, Miller stared through his scope. "Got him," he whispered. But Lakewood's face didn't change. He just lowered his rifle. "It's not over," he said quietly. He wasn't alone. An hour later, a mortar shell fell just short of their position. Then another, closer. The Germans had pinpointed the angle of his shot. Shrapnel hissed through the trees. "Move!" Lakewood shouted. They dove from the farmhouse as the roof caved in behind them. Dirt and debris rained down. When the dust cleared, Miller was coughing, face bloodied. "Jesus, Ben, how the hell did they?" "They had a spotter," Lakewood said grimly. "They always have a spotter." He stared back at the smoldering wreckage of their hide, heart pounding with something that felt heavier than fear, the realization that every trick he'd invented was now being used against him. The hunter had taught the prey too well. That night, huddled in a rain-soaked foxhole, Miller looked over. "You can't keep this up," he said. "You're burning out, man. This isn't sniping anymore. It's witchcraft." Lakewood didn't look at him. "No," he said softly. "It's evolution." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small strip of vine, the last one he'd cut before the rain began. He tied it around his wrist like a charm, muddy and frayed. Miller watched in silence. "You think you can win this way?" he asked. Lakewood's eyes, hollow and sharp, reflected the glow of distant artillery. "I don't need to win," he said. "I just need to make them afraid to pull the trigger." That night, thunder rolled over Anzio. Rain poured into shell craters, and through the storm, a single rifle cracked once, then twice. By morning, 2 more German snipers were dead. But so was Lakewood's sense of certainty. Because when he examined one of the enemy rifles later that dawn, he found something tied to its barrel, a short piece of Italian vine. The Germans had left it there deliberately. A message. They'd learned his language. February 20th, 1944. The shell-shocked outskirts of Anzio were quiet. Too quiet. Corporal Lakewood lay prone beneath a collapsed vineyard trellis, the damp earth pressing against his ribs. His Springfield rifle rested on a burlap sack of sand and broken wine bottles. His scope tracked a cratered dirt road that led to a bombed-out German outpost. He hadn't fired a shot in 30 hours, because every time he moved, someone moved after him. Every time he tugged a vine decoy, there was a pause, then another vine moved across the no-man's land. It was like watching his reflection, but in shattered glass. "They're copying you," Miller had whispered that morning, jaw clenched. "Everything you do, they mimic. Not just the methods. The tempo." Lakewood didn't respond. He was too focused on what lay ahead. 2 days earlier, he'd found the enemy sniper's body with a vine tied to its barrel. Now, there were 6 more bodies left in the open. All too clean. All with perfect line of sight. And every single one had a vine tied to its wrist. It wasn't just mimicry. It was mockery. "They've made a whole sniper cell," Lakewood finally said, his voice hoarse. "A shadow of ours, a mirror line." Miller leaned in. "A phantom line." The name stuck like blood in the throat. For the next 24 hours, The American recon squad logged patterns. The enemy phantom snipers never fired first, never moved during daylight. They waited, reacted, reflected. Lakewood realized this wasn't just counter-sniping. This was a psychological war now, a trap built on rhythm and nerves. That night, in a candlelit cellar beneath a ruined bakery, Lakewood unfurled a map. "They're using triangulation," he muttered, pointing to the marks. 3 confirmed locations, always repositioning after a shot, always baiting with corpses or shadows. He paused. Exactly like us. Miller, bruised and exhausted, exhaled slowly. "So, we're fighting ourselves." "No," Lakewood said. "We're fighting what they think we are." So he planned something reckless. At 0300 hours, under a moonless sky, Lakewood crawled 300 yards into the no-man's land with a dummy rifle, a burlap dummy torso, and a strand of vine wrapped around his chest. He moved silently, inch by inch, to a ruined chicken coop just within their overlapping kill zone. He set up the dummy dressed in an American jacket, helmet on, Springfield clone sticking out of the debris, and rigged the vine to its arm. Then he crawled another 80 yards east and dug himself into a shell crater with a fresh scope angle. This time, the hunter would become the bait. At 0714, the fog lifted just enough to see the decoy. Nothing moved. He waited. A bird took off. Then, a vine twitched. Not his, theirs. Lakewood's fingers curled around the trigger. Across the field, a second dummy stirred. Then a third. German coats, German helmets, vine-operated dummies. "Jesus," he breathed. "They're baiting me with my own trick." One of them moved too far. A glint. Lakewood fired. Crack. A body dropped. No scream, just a thud. Real or staged? Miller whispered over the radio. "I think they just sacrificed one of their own to confirm your position." Lakewood's stomach sank. "Then they're not mimicking me anymore. They're improvising." Within minutes, the artillery began. Whistles. Booms. Dirt exploded where his muzzle had flashed. The crater became a coffin. He ran. Shells chewed up the earth behind him. A tree burst apart like splinters. Lakewood dove through the coop door, coughing blood, his chest burning. Miller pulled him behind sandbags. "They're mapping your instincts, Ben, not just your methods. They know how you think." "Not all of it," Lakewood spat. "They don't know this next part." That night, with every American sniper withdrawn behind the line, Lakewood took a torch and deliberately burned his own decoy perch. The vines, the rifle, the structure, all of it. The flames rose like a funeral pyre in no man's land. Miller stared, horrified. "You're giving it up?" Lakewood nodded. "They're not hunting me anymore," he said, eyes dark. "They're hunting the legend of me. So I'll kill that legend, burn it down. Then what the hell do we use next?" Lakewood turned. Something older. Something they can't copy. In the distance, the last embers of the dummy perch faded into the Italian night. But in Lakewood's hand, beneath his glove, he now held something else. Not a vine, a length of piano wire, cold, thin, and silent. February 23rd, 1944, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of cordite and rot. Fog pooled in the craters like ghosts refusing to leave. Corporal Benjamin Lakewood moved through the wreckage barefoot, his boots slung over his shoulder to muffle the sound. Every step was measured, slow, deliberate. His rifle was wrapped in burlap, his breathing timed with the waves of the distant sea. No vines this time, no string decoys, just the wire and silence. He'd spent the previous night dismantling an abandoned German field piano, scavenged from a destroyed church near the line. The instrument was half burned, but its strings still hummed faintly when touched. Lakewood had cut 7 of them. The plan wasn't mechanical, it was psychological. The piano wire would carry vibrations farther than any vine, even through stone and mud. If he could weave it through the walls of ruined farmhouses and connect it to loose debris helmets, broken shutters, shattered rifles, He could create the illusion of movement across an entire sector. But the true brilliance lay elsewhere. It wasn't about tricking German eyes anymore. It was about breaking German minds. He and Miller began just before dawn, weaving the wires through the ruins of the hamlet of Cisterna Vecchia. They worked silently, moving from crater to crater, running the thin steel through cracks and rubble, looping it around debris, fastening the ends with nails and fragments of glass. "Ben," Miller whispered as he tied off one wire to a door hinge. "This is madness. You can't fight ghosts with piano strings." Lakewood's voice came low. "That's the point. We are the ghosts now." At 8 hours, the fog began to thin. Across the field, the phantom line waited unseen but felt. Lakewood pulled the first wire. A loose helmet clattered against a beam 50 yards to their left. Within seconds, a rifle cracked. The echo bounced through the ruins. He smiled. "There's one." He waited, then tugged another wire, slower, softer. A door creaked. Dust shifted. Another shot. This one panicked. "They're firing blind," Miller whispered, amazed. "Not blind," Lakewood corrected. Afraid. The game of nerves lasted hours. The Germans, unnerved by phantom noises and false echoes, began shifting positions, revealing themselves to Allied spotters who'd been waiting days for a clear shot. By noon, 2 enemy marksmen were confirmed dead. A third fled his position entirely, leaving his scope and rifle behind. The 28th Infantry's front line began to move again, creeping forward under the renewed illusion of safety. Lakewood stayed behind, buried in the ruins, orchestrating chaos through strands of steel. Each wire vibrated differently. One clinked, another moaned, another snapped sharply like a twig underfoot. He could read the battlefield through sound now, not sight. "This is it," he murmured. "We're writing a new language." But language cuts both ways. At 15 hours, the Germans answered back. A shot rang out, not toward his decoy, but toward the wire itself. The bullet sliced the strand inches from Lakewood's hand. He froze, then heard it, the faint, metallic ring traveling through the wire, back through the ruins, echoing from multiple directions. "They've copied it," he whispered. Across the ravine, piano wire tremors answered his own. The Germans were playing his music back at him. Miller's face went pale. "What do we do?" Lakewood stared at the vibrating strand, then looked up toward the sound. "We listen," he said. "And when they play the wrong note, we kill them." For 3 hours, the battlefield turned into a symphony of ghosts. Tensioned strings hummed through shattered windows. Decoys rattled, doors banged, helmets rolled. Every movement echoed another. American, German, both sides pulling invisible wires, both hunting the sound of each other's fear. By twilight, it was impossible to tell who had started what. Even the birds stayed silent. Lakewood finally spotted it, a flicker of dust behind a stone chimney. A vibration out of rhythm. Too fast. Too desperate. He tracked the source, exhaled halfway, and squeezed the trigger. The German sniper fell backward into the rubble. The piano wire tied to his wrist went slack. One less phantom. Afterward, Miller looked at him like he was staring at something not entirely human. "Ben," he said quietly, "you've turned this whole valley into a haunted house." Lakewood didn't answer. He simply began rolling the remaining wires back into a coil. When Miller finally asked, "What now?" Lakewood said, "Now we cut the strings. Let the ghosts rest." That night, thunder rolled in from the coast again. Rain hissed against the steel. In the final glow of the lightning, Miller saw him, Lakewood, silhouetted against the storm, cutting each piano string one by one, letting them twang softly into silence. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He just stood there, hands trembling, eyes hollow. He'd won, but at a cost even he couldn't name. Because when you spend long enough pretending to be a ghost, you start to forget you were ever alive. February 25, 1944, Anzio beachhead, Allied forward observation post. The sun rose behind a haze of smoke and wet fog. In the command dugout, a dozen officers huddled over aerial photos and intercepted German reports. The chatter was low. Then a colonel stood, holding a crumpled piece of field intel. 14 snipers neutralized in 2 days. In a flat sector we haven't advanced on in weeks. Who the hell is Corporal Lakewood? The room went silent. Across the ravine, the man in question was digging a fresh slit trench by hand, not for himself, but for another decoy setup. His fingers were raw, his face was hollow. He hadn't slept in 2 days. But the battlefield had gone quiet. By midday, command sent a jeep. A major from intelligence stepped out. Boots too clean for this place, clipboard under one arm. Corporal Benjamin Lakewood? Lakewood didn't look up, just kept weaving a vine through a cracked helmet. The major crouched beside him. We know what you've been doing. The wires, the piano strings, the fake kills. A pause. They're not fake anymore, Lakewood said. Infiltration. Codified. That was the phrase they used in the next debriefing. Lakewood was ordered to sit at a folding table inside a makeshift HQ tent, while men with pins on their collars mapped out psychological sniper tactics, field improvised. The irony was lost on no one. His unauthorized methods, once threatened with court-martial, were now being copied across 3 regiments. They called it STALK, Sniper Tactics Against Lone Killers. Lakewood called it madness in a uniform. The first field replication happened in Sector Red. A junior lieutenant tried to rig a decoy system using tripwire and ration cans. He mistimed the vibrations and got 2 of his own men shot in the confusion. In another sector, a field manual based on Lakewood's reports was issued to sharpshooter squads, encouraging terrain musicality and tactical illusions. Lakewood wasn't asked. He wasn't briefed. He was used. Meanwhile, the breakthrough was real. The phantom wire tactic caused such a disruption in German sniper doctrine that Wehrmacht command pulled back elite marksmen from the front for retraining. Panic rumors spread tales of American ghost snipers who didn't need scopes, didn't use bullets, just drove you mad until you gave up your position or shot your own men. The 28th Infantry finally advanced past the ruins of Cisterna Vecchia. No shell barrage, no tanks, just a whisper through the wire, and silence on the other end. Back at the aid station, Miller read the memo pinned to the canvas wall. Effective immediately. All STALK operators must file after-action reports and submit decoy placement diagrams. He muttered, "They've turned your war into a worksheet." Lakewood didn't respond. His hands were wrapped in gauze, cracked from cold steel and soil. His rifle sat untouched in the corner. The brass gave him a choice. Stay at the front and train more squads, or return to Naples to help write the manual. He chose neither. Instead, he asked for a transfer. Not home, not to rest, but to the Engineer Corps. Why? The colonel asked. Because you can't turn ghosts into doctrine, Lakewood said. And you sure as hell shouldn't try. They never approved the transfer. Instead, they gave him a new rank, Staff Sergeant, a new rifle, a commendation letter signed by a general who'd never heard a wire sing. The battlefield had changed. The enemy was on edge. But so was Lakewood. That night he burned every strand of wire he had left, every sketch, every note, every scribbled map of fake sniper nests and vibration patterns. Miller watched from the doorway of the tent. You really think it ends here? Lakewood looked at the fire. No, but I have to. The next day, the first official Wire Phantom unit deployed in the Leary Valley. Young men, eager and clean, hauling spools of piano wire like ammunition. None of them knew the sound it made when a German sniper screamed into the fog and didn't come back. War absorbs everything, even madness, even miracles. Lakewood had crafted a weapon from nothing but string, fear, and silence. He had turned the battlefield into a psychological minefield, where the enemy fought shadows and echoes, and then the machine swallowed it whole. His creation, born in desperation, became an instrument of policy. And the ghosts multiplied. March 6th, 1944, south of Cisterna, Italy. The mist was unusually thick that morning, crawling low across the crater-pocked fields like breath from the dead. It clung to helmets, pooled in foxholes, and muffled every sound except one. Twang. A sharp metallic snap. Not from a rifle, not from a mine. A vibration in the air, subtle, unnatural, as if someone had plucked a cello string strung between trees. Private Russell, just 19, froze. He'd been briefed. If you hear the wire, stay low. The enemy shoots at ghosts now. 10 seconds passed. Then came the thud of boots, not theirs. A shadow moved across the trench lip. Then another. And then silence. Again. The wire had spoken and death followed. But Lakewood wasn't there. 2 weeks earlier, he'd vanished. No orders, no jeep, no goodbye. The last anyone saw of him was the night of February 19th, sitting alone near the edge of the ravine, stringing a fresh length of piano wire between 2 shattered pine trunks. The moon hung low behind him, like a dying lantern. In his journal, never submitted to command, he wrote just 6 words. The war heard me. That's enough. He didn't desert. Not exactly. Unofficial reports claimed he had gone rogue, creating his own phantom corridor, a stretch of no man's land so laced with false trenches, vibration triggers, wire-pulled decoys, and mock radio clicks that entire Wehrmacht units avoided it altogether. Germans started calling it der Hopfpfad, the hollow path. Patrols sent into it vanished. Marksmen stationed to watch it returned shaken, mumbling about movement without footsteps and targets that bled no blood. No one had ever seen who operated the zone. But it didn't take long for the whisper to spread. Lakewood was still out there. By late March, G2 intelligence logged something odd. In sectors adjacent to the so-called hollow path, German snipers had abandoned elevated positions. Many left scopes behind. Even more disturbing, some helmets were found tied to trees, filled with leaves and wired at the chin strap. It was mimicry. Even the enemy had begun copying Lakewood. Meanwhile, Allied units crossing the region reported strange findings. One platoon stumbled upon an enemy sniper, dead in a shallow nest, rifle untouched, no visible wounds. But beside him was a snapped length of string, trailing off into a dark hole. No one followed it. In another case, a flamethrower team torched a small ravine by mistake. What burned wasn't enemy encampment. It was a wire complex. Decoys, tethers, tripwires rigged to nothing but sound. Dozens of them. Field medics found no signs of recent habitation, just silence, and the eerie sense they were walking through someone else's mind. Lakewood's name never appeared in the reports. Officially, he'd been rotated out for combat fatigue. But rumors swirled. And then, in April, the final echo came. April 2nd, 1944 Allied listening post, north of Aprilia. At 3:11 a.m., a signal was intercepted on a dead frequency, a series of tapping sounds, spaced like Morse code but not matching any known message. They were vibrations. A young operator, curious, recorded them. Analyzing the tape later, a sergeant who had once served alongside Lakewood turned pale. "It's him," he whispered. "It's his pattern." Lakewood had a habit: 3 slow taps, 2 quick, then 1 long pull, like a signature in string. That pattern pulsed again, and then never returned. The area was later shelled. No body was ever found, but men kept reporting wire decoys months after. Even when the Allies pushed toward Rome. Even when the snows melted and the front line moved. One German sniper captured at Anzio confessed under interrogation. "We didn't shoot unless we were sure. We saw your ghosts too many times." Lakewood had done more than kill with wire. He had rewired the battlefield itself. He made noise into a weapon, stillness into a trap, imagination into fear, and fear spreads faster than any bullet. Years later, during a veterans' reunion in New Jersey, Miller sat with 2 engineers who had trained under Lakewood's repurposed tactics. They laughed over drinks, called him a crazy bastard, talked about the time he used piano wire to kill a whole sniper battalion without pulling a trigger. But then one of them went quiet. "You ever wonder if we used it too much?" he asked. "That we built a doctrine out of trauma?" Miller didn't answer, just pulled a rusted length of wire from his coat pocket and set it on the table. None of them touched it. May 28th, 1953. Sicily. Rome American Cemetery. Nettuno, Italy. The marble rows stretch endlessly, like frozen waves across a sea of silence. The war is long over. The boys who survived it are now men with gray around their temples. Some came back for the ceremonies. Some never left the battlefield at all. And yet, here in the far eastern corner of the cemetery, past the plaques and the speeches, past the official names carved in granite, there's a patch of earth that no one claims. No cross, no star, no inscription, just a small ring of stones. Inside it lies nothing, except a single length of wire twisted like a noose. And every year, on the anniversary of the Anzio landings, someone no one knows who places an M1 helmet upside down over it, filled with pine needles, a tribute, a code. Those who served with him never speak his name, because his name was never meant to be remembered, only feared. Corporal Benjamin Lakewood, the quiet kid from Pittsburgh, the black Marine who rewrote sniping with a ball of string and a hammer, who learned that sound can kill before a bullet ever does, who was court-martialed twice, awarded once, and vanished without a trace. A had no statue. He left no descendants, but he left something more dangerous, a method. In the years following the war, a strange rumor made its way into sniper schools in Quantico, Virginia. They called it the Lakewood technique, though only in hushed tones. It wasn't part of any official manual. It was passed like an old folk tale. Decoy. Wait. Listen. Pull. If the wire goes slack, shoot. If it stays taut, let them imagine what's holding it. Instructors denied it existed. But in Vietnam, Korea, and even Afghanistan, soldiers still reported encountering ghost snipers, targets that drew fire, disappeared, and were never found. In the jungle, in the desert, in the mountains, always, the wire. Even the Germans had adopted fragments of it. Captured Wehrmacht field manuals from late 1944 show diagrams for Seilpup string puppets used to lure out Allied sharpshooters. It was almost comical. Helmets on broomsticks, sandbags rigged to strings, mirrors on tripods. But none of it ever worked like Lakewood's, because they missed the point. Lakewood wasn't just building traps. He was building fear. Miller once said it best, years after the war, on a live radio interview when asked why Lakewood never returned. Some men survive the war. Some men survive in it. Lakewood became it. His disappearance remained an open case in Marine records until 1959, when a clerk finally closed it with a pencil line and the cold word, MIA. But to those who fought alongside him, that was never the right designation. He didn't go missing. He became missing on purpose. To them, Benjamin Lakewood was the only man who made the enemy fight shadows, who made them waste ammo on whispers, who made an army of ghosts out of one sniper and a wire. March 2004, Discovery. Near the ruins of an old farmhouse south of Anzio, a group of Italian schoolchildren exploring the hillside uncovered what they thought was a spiderweb in the trees. It wasn't. It was wire. Dozens of them, stretched in patterns no one could decipher, rigged to pine cones, old glass bottles, even rusted helmets. Most had snapped with age, but one was still taut. At its end, buried beneath the dirt, they found a corroded metal tag. The name was nearly illegible, but 3 letters could still be read. LWD. They reported it to local authorities. The U.S. military was notified. No further action was taken. Back in Pittsburgh, a letter arrived at an old address no longer occupied. It was never opened. Inside was a photograph, grainy, black and white. A tree, a perch, a rifle leaning against the branch, and beside it, an M1 helmet, hung upside down, filled with pine needles. Legacy. War creates heroes, but the battlefield forgets them quickly. Lakewood was not a hero in the official sense. He broke rules. He disobeyed orders. He fought alone. But every man who walked through Anzio's haunted forests after him owed him their lives. He turned fear into a weapon, not through firepower, but through psychology, silence, misdirection, and he did it with nothing more than a vine and some string. The story ends, not with his death, but with the echo he left behind. A sniper who vanished, a wire that never broke, a name they never spoke because they were too afraid to.